Alla Tulia Meldonia Ahara Mariese, and welcome, dear friends, to another episode of Tolkien Untangled. My name is Rainbow Dave, and in this episode, we're going to start a new tale of Tolkien's. We're going to begin the story of Feanor and the Silmarils. And if you've seen the last series on the beginning of days, then you'll know that we looked at everything, didn't we? From the creation of the universe itself, to the creation of the planet Arda, to the building of the lamps and the age of the lamps, and the destruction of the lamps, spoiler. We looked at the awakening of the Elves and the eastern lands of Cuivienen, their great migration west through the lands of Middle-earth, all the way to the western continent of Annamare, where they dwell in the land of Valinor with the Valar, who are, effectively kind of the gods of Arda. And that's where we're going to pick up in this episode. So the main thing that I really talked about last time is how the Dark Lord Melkor, the source of all evil in the world, took power and covered Middle-earth in darkness. And of course, as you'll know if you saw the last episode, the main victims of Melkor's tyranny are the newly awakened elves. So in response, the gods and the angels, the Ainur, that's the Valar and the Maiar, came to Middle-earth to overthrow Melkor, and they fought a great war for the sake of the elves. And Melkor was overthrown at the end of this war, and he was bound in the great chain Angainor, and he was locked away in the halls of Mandos for 3 long ages. And in the peace that followed, 3 clans of elves journeyed with the Valar and joined them in Valinor to live in the peaceful, blissful, undying lands. And that's where we're going to pick up in this video. And today I'm going to introduce what are possibly the most important artifacts in the entire story. These are, of course, the Silmarils, for which the Silmarillion is named. And we'll get to them in a little bit. But before we do, we need to spend a little bit of time getting to know the elves in Valinor. And of the 3 elven clans, the Vanyar, the Teleri, and the Noldor, it is the Noldor whose story we're really going to tell. So, if you remember from the last video, the Noldor are the mightiest and the most, let's say, skillful and sort of the greatest in lore of any of the other elven clans. And they live in Valinor in their great Noldorin capital city that is called Tirion upon Tuna. Now, the Noldor are ruled by their High King, Finwe. And if you remember, he's the guy who led his people all the way to Valinor in the last episode. Now, obviously, elves are immortal, and at this time there is no sun or moon in the sky, and so days and years and time don't really exist in the way that we think of it. You see, all light in Valinor comes from these 2 magical trees, Laurelin the gold and Telperion the silver, and this means that talking about dates and ages and how much time has passed is actually a rather difficult thing to do. But what we can say is that the 3 ages in which Melkor is imprisoned is known as the noontide of Valinor. And it's during these long ages of peace and utter bliss that this part of the story takes place. So, anyway, at some point, we don't know exactly when, but at some point, the High King Finwe took a wife, whom he loved greatly and gladly. They're Tolkien's exact words. Now, Finwe's wife is called Miriel Serinde, and she is said to be the finest in weaving and needlework of anyone in Valinor, surpassing even the Valar, even Vaire, who is the Valar of weaving. She's the goddess of weaving. It's mad. But, after, let's say, an appropriate amount of time, Miriel became pregnant, and she bore Finwe his first son. Now, this son is going to become a very, very, very important person throughout the story, and Miriel decides to call her son Feanor, which means the spirit of fire in the Quenya language of the Noldor. However, unfortunately, Feanor's birth is not a happy one. You see, Tolkien says that Miriel put so much of her spirit into Feanor that she grew weak, and she declared that she would never again bear another child, for the strength that would have nourished the life of many had gone forth into Feanor. So poor Miriel, right here, right at the beginning of the story, she becomes so weak and so frail that Finwe went to the Valar Lord Irmo, who is kind of like the god of dreams and sleep and visions and all things psychedelic, and Finwe takes Miriel into Irmo's gardens of healing and rest in the hope that she might recover. Now, by the way, these gardens, they're pretty groovy because Irmo's gardens are called Lorien, and of course it is Lorien that inspires the realm of Lothlorien that we're all familiar with from the Lord of the Rings. Although, remember, what we're talking about now is happening thousands and thousands and thousands of years before the Lord of the Rings, so it's going to be quite a long time before we get to that Lothlorien. Anyway, Miriel did find some rest in Irmo's garden, but she never did fully recover her strength. And to be fair, I don't think she ever really wanted to. You see, whilst giving birth to Feanor, Miriel had a vision of her son's future. Now, she doesn't share what she saw with Finwe, but she did say something very interesting and incredibly foreboding. Miriel said, "It is indeed unhappy, and I would weep if I were not so weary. But hold me blameless in this, and in all that may come after." So, yeah, that's pretty ominous, isn't it? Bear that in mind as we go forward. But anyway, eventually Miriel just grew so weak that her spirit eventually departed her body. And in silence, her spirit passed away into the halls of Mandos, which is where the souls of dead elves are held and judged. Now, Finwe mourned his wife a huge amount, and for a time he went to go and visit her body, which was forever preserved by Irmo's wife and her handmaidens in the gardens of Lorien. But eventually, Finwe just can't bring himself to come to Lorien anymore, for the pain is so great, and he is the only being in Valinor who is deprived of joy. It's so sad. But anyway, in Miriel's absence, Finwe puts all of his love and devotion into their son, Feanor. And Finwe soon discovers that his beloved son is an absolute prodigy, like in every sense of the word. In fact, Feanor is described as being the mightiest of all Ilúvatar's children in body and mind and subtlety. So, although Feanor never actually knew his mother, he does love his father intensely. And from a young age, he demonstrated this enormous skill and wisdom. You see, Feanor is, at his heart, at his core, a craftsman. And in his youth, he forged the Palantiri. Now, these are, of course, the seeing stones that we've seen in Lord of the Rings that are used by Saruman and Sauron. Now, Feanor also studied language, and he actually developed a new type of elven writing called Tengwa script. So when you look at the Lord of the Rings and you see the elven writing on the page, or you see the Palantirs, both of these things were created tens of thousands of years before by Feanor. But I should say that as well as crafting, Feanor also has a really restless spirit. And he spent a lot of time wandering around Valinor and venturing a long way from the Noldorin capital city of Tirion. And as Feanor grew, he developed a very close friendship with another elven smith called Matan. Now, I feel like the first thing that people always notice about Matan is that he is one of the very few elves that has a beard. Yeah, in the whole Legendarium there are only two, and Matan is one of them. And I think the beard kind of represents that Matan is a little bit older and a lot more skilled than the average elf, even the average elf in Valinor. Now, Matan is also a genius craftsman, and he learned his craft at the feet of the Valar Aule himself. Remember, Aule is the smith of the Valar. He's kind of like the Greek god Hephaestus, or maybe the Roman god Vulcan. Anyway, Matan teaches Feanor metallurgy and stonework, and it's not long before the student surpasses the teacher. Feanor's ability to create was absolutely unrivaled, but there was one more thing that he wanted from Matan. You see, in a ceremony beneath the two trees of Valinor, Feanor eventually married Matan's daughter, an elf maiden called Nerdanel. And for a time, Neardinel and Feanor are very happy. You see, Neardinel had inherited her father's skill at sculpting, which had taught her patience, and her peaceful nature kind of assuaged her husband's fiery temper. And it's actually said that Neardinel created sculptures that were so lifelike and so impressive that they were sometimes mistaken for real people. And out of everyone in Valinor, Neardinel is, for a time, the only person who is able to influence Feanor and to counsel him. And over time, Neardinel bears Feanor 7 sons. And Feanor loves each of these sons as much as his father loved him. Now, I should just add, quick side note, 7 sons, that is a lot. I mean, elves are known for having, maybe 1 child, 2 children. Galadriel had 1 child. Elrond, well, he had 3, and in the First Age, to be fair, some of them did have 4, as one guy even had 5, but 7 sons, no other elf anywhere in the story has that many children. I mean, elves are immortal, they live forever. Just imagine how unsustainable it would be if every elf had 7 children. Anyway, moving on, everything suddenly changed for Feanor when his father did something absolutely unheard of for an elf. You see, King Finwe remarried. After a long period of mourning, Finwe eventually met an elf of the Vanyar called Indis, and Finwe totally fell in love with her. Now, before long, the two of them were married, and the second wife, Indis, bore Finwe 2 more sons. The eldest of these sons is called Fingolfin, and the youngest is called Finarfin. And these 2 are going to be important characters. Now, I know it's very confusing because they all have such similar names, Finwe, Feanor, Fingolfin, Finarfin, everyone sounds similar, and that's just because Tolkien likes to make things as confusing as possible. But anyway, do try and keep them in your mind, because as I say, they will be very important later. But anyway, despite their bond of kinship, Feanor really disliked his stepmother Indis, and he was especially wary of his half-brothers, whom he feared might one day supplant him as the future High King of the Noldor. So there you go, that's Feanor, Fingolfin and Finarfin, the princes of the Noldor. But whilst all of this is going on, there's another very important branch of the story that needs to be told. So while Feanor was busy mistrusting his half-brothers, especially Fingolfin, the older one, the 14 Valar gathered in their sacred divine city of Valmar for a very important meeting. You see, they were all summoned by the king of the Valar, Manwe, and his wife Varda, the queen of starlight. And everyone was there with them. We have Tulkas the champion, Yavanna the giver of fruit, Ulmo the lord of waters, Aule the smith, Orome the huntsman, Nienna the weeper, Irmo that dream guy, and of course, Mandos himself, the keeper of the dead. You see, they were all gathered to discuss the fate of their most treacherous prisoner, Melkor. Now, for 3 ages, Melkor had languished in chains, but the time had finally come for his judgment. So, Melkor was brought, vanquished and humiliated, to the Ring of Doom, which is called the Mahanaxar, and each of the Valar was now tasked with deciding his fate. So Manwe, being a champion of justice, demanded that Melkor deliver a statement in his own defense. So Melkor knelt at Manwe's feet and begged his brother's forgiveness. See, Melkor claimed that he was changed and he'd repented entirely of his evil nature. Now, both Tulkas and Ulmo are totally unconvinced, and they urged Manwe to imprison Melkor once more, or safer still, banish him through the doors of night into the timeless void where he can never hurt anyone again. However, Manwe was made and filled with such pure goodness that he is simply incapable of fathoming and understanding evil. You see, he was completely free of it. Now, I really can't stress this enough, alright? You see, every single bad thing that ever happens, really, from now up until the destruction of the One Ring at the end of Lord of the Rings, all of it, all the bad things could have been avoided if Manwë had just listened to Tulkas and Ulmo. But, as I'm sure you all know, to the tragedy of literally everyone, Manwë decided to set Melkor free. And people give Isildur a hard time. But, to be fair, at first at least, it did seem like maybe Melkor truly had repented. He used none of his former power, and he sought only to counsel and advise. And for a while, everyone who sought Melkor's counsel did benefit from it. But they were all of them deceived. For in Melkor's imprisonment, only one thing had changed: his hatred for the elves. So, if you remember, it was for their sake that he was overthrown in the first place. And now seeing the elves living amongst the Valar in bliss, that was an intolerable affront. For 3 ages, Melkor had waited, and each day his malice had grown, but his cunning had grown too. You see, he no longer wanted to simply destroy the elves, now he wants to corrupt them. And of all the elves in Valinor, he turns all his attentions pretty much solely towards the Noldor. You see, the Vanir, he thought, well, they're just too good. They're just too obsessed with the Valar, and they are literally incorruptible. And the Teleri, the Sea Elves, Melkor sees them as, I don't know, as being a bit too humble, a bit too content, and not really even worth bothering with. But the Noldor, they possess the perfect balance of power and ambition to use it. And so the Noldor soon became Melkor's exclusive prey. Now perhaps you can see where I'm going with this, because Melkor's hatred for the Noldor segues us very nicely back to Feanor and his father Finwe and all his family problems in Tirion. So for a good whack of time, there's really just quiet disdain between Feanor and his half-brothers, Fingolfin and Finarfin. And while Feanor hones his craft and raises his sons, both Fingolfin and Finarfin also fathered children of their own. And despite the animosity of their fathers, I must say, the sons of Feanor actually developed a really nice close bond with their cousins, the sons of Fingolfin and the daughter of Finarfin. Now, in time, Feanor also grew very close with Finarfin's daughter. He saw real potential in his young niece, and although she had inherited the golden hair and fairness of her grandmother Indis of the Vanir, she also shared her uncle Feanor's pride and ambition. Now, if you've never read the Silmarillion, then most of these names, Feanor, Finwe, Fingolfin, they probably won't mean that much to you, but I reckon you will definitely recognize Feanor's niece. Her name is Galadriel. So Feanor and Galadriel began spending a lot of time together, and one of the things they talked about was the mysterious lands across the sea, Middle-earth. And both Feanor and Galadriel became fascinated with this strange eastern continent. Because don't forget, both Feanor and Galadriel were born in Valinor during this noontide, and so neither of them have actually ever set foot in Middle-earth. All they know of it are the stories of Finwe and the older generation, and of course, the Valar. So, feeding off her uncle's ambition, Galadriel became a little bit obsessed with one day ruling over a kingdom of her own in Middle-earth. And obviously, we all know what that turns into.
Caras Galathon, the heart of Elvendom on earth.
However, despite their mutual determination, Galadriel's relationship with Feanor began to dramatically sour when she saw the fire that burned so endlessly inside him. Now I know Feanor may be gifted beyond measure, but he is also brash and wrathful. And eventually his pride began to, frighten Galadriel. Now, it can definitely be said that Feanor is endowed with the greatest of gifts in knowledge and power of any of his race. And I feel like people often use that to defend him and to make excuses for his actions. You know, he is a genius after all. But I would say that the exact same thing is true of Melkor. So think about that and try and remember Tolkien does draw these subtle parallels between Feanor and Melkor. It's just a hint, just a little bit of foreshadowing that perhaps Feanor might not be quite as perfect as some of the other elves in Tolkien's Legendarium. Anyway, Feanor's relationship with Galadriel eventually ends up going a step further, and Feanor becomes weirdly entranced with Galadriel's hair. Now, in the books, Galadriel's hair is described as being radiant gold that is shot with silver, and it shines with the light of both the trees Laurel the gold and Telperion the silver. Now, 3 times Feanor asked Galadriel for a strand of her hair, and 3 times she refused him. Now, there's something really cool here that's worth noting, because in many thousands of years in the future, Gimli the dwarf will also ask Galadriel for a strand of her hair. And do you remember what she does?
She gave me 3.
Now make of that what you will. Anyway, Feanor's obsessions matched with his skill made him a very tantalizing target. And while he poured his passion into his work, he was secretly being watched by Melkor. So Melkor bided his time, and eventually he approached Feanor in a fair form and offered him counsel. Now, Feanor is no fool, I'll say that much, and he is immediately suspicious of Melkor. But Melkor displayed no ill will, not at this point. All he did was praise Feanor and feed his pride with compliments. You see, Melkor told Feanor that his creations were priceless and that nothing could surpass them. Well, nothing except the light of the trees. Now, at first, Feanor didn't think very much of this flattery, but Melkor's words began to fester in his mind. Now, as I said, Feanor's created these objects of exquisite beauty, but he has not yet replicated the work of the Valar. And it's this desire to be utterly unsurpassable that inspires Feanor to craft his greatest achievement. So, through means unknown, Feanor captured some of Laureline's golden light, and he mixed it with the silver light of Telperion. Then he somehow encased this light into crystal, and he forged them into 3 great jewels. And to each of those jewels he poured a part of his own essence, so that they could never ever be replicated, and they were essentially bound eternally to Feanor's bloodline. Now, again, this is very, very important, alright? These aren't just gems. Tolkien describes these jewels as alive, impenetrable, and sacred. And of course, I reckon most of you already know, Feanor named these creations the Silmarils. And if the name doesn't give it away, these jewels are destined to become the catalyst for all the drama and all the strife that is chronicled in Tolkien's The Silmarillion. So, when Feanor finally finished, he presented the Silmarils to the Valar, and he decreed that no one should ever mar his precious jewels. And the Valar were so impressed that Vada, the Lady of Light, hallowed the Silmarils, and she made it so that no mortal flesh nor anything of evil would ever be able to touch them, and any unclean hand would be scorched and withered by their magic. So the Silmarils became the pride of Valinor, but to Feanor, they were more than that. They were his own essence, and Melkor knew it. And Melkor watched Feanor's growing fixation with glee. For Melkor knew that the Silmarils represented the pinnacle of the power of the Noldor, and so he vowed to make them his. And that, I'm afraid, brings us to the end of this video. But if you liked it, make sure you hit like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next one. And as always, because you've made it all the way to the end of the episode, I have another little Tolkien fun fact to share with you all. So this week's fun fact is actually a fun fact about the Lord of the Rings movies. Now, I'm sure many of you will know that during this scene in the Two Towers, Viggo Mortensen actually broke 2 of his toes while kicking that helmet. So the pain in his scream is real here. However, what you may not know is that at around the same time Viggo injured himself, Orlando Bloom also fell off his horse and actually cracked a rib. Now what's crazy is that Brett Beatty, who is the size double, the scale double for Gimli, the guy you see in all the scenes where Gimli's standing next to someone, he also dislocated his knee around the same time. So this means that during this scene, where the 3 hunters are chasing the Uruk-hai, which Aragorn in the book describes as being such a chase that shall be accounted a marvel among the 3 kindreds of elves, dwarves and men, all 3 actors are running through the wilds of New Zealand with a significant injury, which blows my mind, and it's another reason I respect the movies so much. Those 3 actors were absolute troopers. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Navaya Melanin.